Okay, so here we are in part 3. Let me just make the screens bigger. And we're going to discuss the precursors to young people committing crime. And we're also going to touch on youth sex offenders because I'm sure many of you would not think about young people committing that type of crime. All right, so antisocial behaviour. This can be something as simple as running away from home. And the precursors to delinquency are the things that we explained: low family income, poor housing, large family size, convicted parent, harsh or erratic discipline, low intelligence, or early school leaving. So this study, the Cambridge Study of Delinquent Development, CSDD, was conducted in 1996 by Farrington, who has the highest number of criminal studies published in the world. So this guy really knows his stuff. It was a longitudinal study of 411 males who were first studied at age 8 in 1961 and studied them up until the age of 50. They all lived in a working class deprived inner city area of London. So they looked at both official convictions and self-reported offending. 41% of the men were convicted between the ages of 10 and 50, mostly between the ages of 19 and 28. And the average was 5 convictions. The most important childhood risk factors happened between ages 8 to 10 and included family criminality, daring or risk-taking behaviour, low school achievement, poverty and poor parenting. Those who started their criminal behaviour the earliest in age committed the most crimes, although only 7% of the males were defined as chronic offenders, accounting for about half of the recorded offences in the study. Overall, his findings were that early intervention is the best way to prevent delinquency and future criminal behaviour. So as you can see, there have been some longitudinal studies conducted where they started looking at young people, mainly boys, at a very young age. Another study that was done by Hapasalo and Tremblay in 1994 was done on young boys in a school where the teachers were asked to rate 1,000 boys on aggression. So that's a good size for a study, 1,000. And they grouped them into 5 fighting patterns. So these boys were rated at the ages of 6, 10, 11 and 12. So they were followed for 6 years. They were all from low SES backgrounds and they were from Montreal in Canada. So the stable high fighters, there was only 8% of them, but they were aggressive at every time that was measured. And as it says down the bottom, they were the ones that were found to come from the most socially disadvantaged home environments. The high on fighters, which were the late onset fighters, they didn't start in kindy but started later on. So they weren't fighting right from the beginning. The desisting started early but didn't continue. The variable fought on and off. And thankfully, still over 50%, but only just, never engaged in fighting at all. But the interesting figure to take home there is that the stable high fighters who were aggressive from every age 6 through 12 came from really disadvantaged home environments. And the last one that we'll talk about is the Berlin Crime Study that looked at male adult offenders admitted to prison in Berlin, obviously, in 1976, and then they were followed for at least 25 years. They were asked questions throughout that 25-year period about their offending. Now, 17% of those that they were looking at actually died, and this is a really, really high death rate among prisoners. So they lost quite a few out of their study from death. But they looked at the types of offences that they committed, and again, it was mainly non-violent crime. Property offences and fraud took up 60% of the figures, and robbery and bodily harm only took up 10%. But the sexual offences and homicide were quite rare. So this just tells you what all the different types of offenders are, and decreased in the top one should be over the other side. So adolescent limited offenders reached their maximum offending by age 20 and then decreased. And I had fixed that, but it came back again. Never mind. Adolescent limited offenders, we've already discussed that group. These are the ones that peak at around the 15 to 18 and then stop. Limited serious offenders, sometimes seriousness escalated, but then all of a sudden it ceased around age 30. So they began as children, it escalated, and then they just stopped too. Persistent offenders had many risk factors and high recidivism. So lots and lots of risk factors that accumulated. Remember, I mentioned that it was cumulative and they continued to offend. Your occasional offenders, low delinquency, absence of childhood risk. Offending may be associated with critical life events and they did specialist offending, so unusual type crimes. But this is offenders that offend when something stressful happens in their lives. So something stressful happens, they offend, and then they stop. And then you've got your late starting offenders that are similar to occasional, but offending is not triggered by life events. So these could be your professional criminals, and you might actually be able to apply rational choice theory to this group, where they're weighing up the benefits and the costs to themselves of committing this offence. And adolescent sex offending. Well, the risk factors for this group are really, really quite different. An early onset of sexually abusive behaviour has happened usually when they're quite young, because that's where they start offending, at a very young age. They can have male victims, multiple victims, but overall they exhibit very poor social skills. But the biggest risk factor for this group is being abused themselves. So you look at a lot of sex offenders, and Dennis Ferguson is one here, and they become sex offenders after being abused themselves, and that becomes their norm. Okay, that's part 3, which is a really, really little short one. We're going to finish at about 7 minutes. In part 4, we're going to discuss the theories that surround delinquency.